back to another exciting week of organizational behavior. You know, you'd have to be living in a cave to not know that leadership has become such an important topic. You know, it seems like everywhere you go, somebody's talking about leadership, somebody's writing a book about leadership. You know, it's hard to get into the airport, to walk through the airport terminal without tripping over a stack of books on leadership. And these books are written by people who are celebrity leaders, people who've led successful businesses, maybe entertainers, maybe athletes, maybe coaches, but everybody's got an angle, everybody's got something to say about leadership, don't they? And really, leadership has become the crown jewel of organizational behavior. That's right. Leadership is part of the field of organizational behavior. It's a very important part. And so hopefully this week, as we go through a couple of chapters in our textbook, and as we discuss leadership online, you're going to be able to maybe weed through, maybe ferret through some of these ideas. You know, there's a lot has been said about leadership, but guess what? Not everything is equally as valid, as equally as useful. And as graduate students taking an OB class, you need to understand what are some of the more substantial, empirically validated ideas about leadership that you can really take to the bank, ideas that will help you to lead more effectively in your organizations. So this week, we're going to learn everything you've ever wanted to know, and probably more than you wanted to know about the topic of leadership. So the first thing we want to do is we want to talk about the nature of leadership. Our book talks about the nature of leadership as a process which involves the use of non-coercive influence, right? Non-coercive. That means you're not just beating somebody over the head. That means you're not just threatening them with a gun. That's not leadership. That's coercion. Leadership does not involve coercion. Also, it describes it as a property, as the set of characteristics attributed to someone who is perceived to use influence successful. All right, so leadership resides in a person, right? Traditionally, we've seen that leadership resides in a person who exercises it. Now, some of the more contemporary approaches would challenge that leadership resides in a single person, or that people even need to be present, right, for there to be leadership. And we'll talk about these more in our second video on leadership. But suffice it to say that it's a property that it's a characteristics within a person. And then, of course, it is influence itself, the ability to affect the perceptions, beliefs, attitudes, motivations, and behavior of others, right? So if you're not influencing anybody, then you're not leading them. Now, if you look at table 12.1, you'll see what they call the distinctions between management and leadership. Now, a lot has been said about this, trying to make a distinction between management and leadership, because they're not the same thing. And so, according to this chart, and I think this is a good way to look at it, in terms of creating an agenda, management is about planning and budgeting, where leadership is about establishing direction, all right? So management tries to control things, it tries to predict things, it tries to make things manageable, to get our hands around them, as where leadership really is focused on that vision, where are we going, what's important, not just how do we do it, but what are we doing, why are we doing these things, what are the right things to do, right? Warren Bennis said that. It's not just about doing things right, but it's about doing the right things. In terms of developing a human network for achieving the agenda, management is about organizing and staffing, establishing structure, right, providing policies and procedures, those kinds of things, all very important. Leadership, however, is more in terms of an HR perspective. It's more about aligning people, communication, communicating the vision, to all those whose cooperation may be needed to influence the creation of teams, etc., etc. So in this regard, leadership has much more to do with this kind of alignment and getting people to cooperate, to buy in, so to speak. In terms of executing plans, management has to do with controlling and problem solving, as where leadership is more about motivating and inspiring. All right, so you can see that managers are more concerned with the control aspect, with problem solving, troubleshooting, as where leadership is more concerned with motivating and inspiring and getting people on board. And then in terms of outcome, management has to do with producing a degree of predictability and order, as where leadership is about producing change. All right, so big difference. Management is about the status quo. It's about predictability, stability. Leadership is about change, often dramatic, right? And it's been said that leadership really is about producing change. In fact, if there's no change happening, you're probably not leading something. If you're just trying to keep things steady and predictable and orderly, then you're probably managing. If you're disrupting things, if you're creating new vision, if you're getting people inspired and motivated about going in new directions, then you're providing leadership. Now, in terms of an actual person, sometimes the question is, well, is it better to be a leader or to be a manager? Well, in reality, both of these properties reside in a single person, right? So if you're a manager, if you're in a management position, you should be doing some leading, right? There's not too many positions that are just called leader, right? Typically, leaders are managers who also embody some of these functions of leadership. So we can kind of conceptually look at management and leadership as two different things, but in practicality and reality, both of these things reside in one person. Okay, now that was just sort of some background, some overview, big picture stuff on leadership. Let's look at some of the specific ways that leadership has been studied over the years. Now, the earliest approach was what was called the trait approach to leadership. This was also known as the great man approach, right? And this approach attempts to identify stable and enduring character traits that differentiate effective leaders from non-leaders. So initially, in the study of leadership, it was thought that there was personal qualities or characteristics that a person had that made them different from non-leaders. And so the original academic look at leadership had to do with these quality traits. And initially they looked at things like family of origin, birth order, the height, of somebody, how much they weighed, the shape of their head. I mean, all kinds of freaky ways that they thought they'd be able to tell a leader from a non-leader. And in the end, most of that stuff was pretty inconclusive. And so there still are some remnants of this trait approach that we still do look at the quality and characteristics of individuals. And you'll see that some of the kind of trait approaches that are still being used, talked about, studied, are things like emotional intelligence, drive, motivation, honesty, integrity, self-confidence, cognitive ability, knowledge of business, charisma. All right, so when we talk about these things, we're talking about traits that the leader actually possesses that help them to be more effective as leaders. Now, once the trait approaches, they kind of concluded that there was no definitive set of traits, they started to look at other approaches to leadership. And these are what were called the behavioral approaches, all right? And there were several studies, famous studies that were done that are indicative of this approach. And these were known as the Michigan studies, the Ohio State studies, and then something called the leadership grid. Now, let's take a look at these in order. Now, they're all essentially the same thing, and I probably shouldn't spend too much time breaking all these down. Let me just give an overview of these, though. Now, if you look at the Michigan studies, you'll see that the whole question here had to do with looking at what leaders actually did. Not who they were, not the traits as in the earlier theories, but what did leaders actually do day in and day out. And it boiled down to two things, that leaders were concerned about job-centered approaches, job-centered behavior, and employee-centered behavior. Okay, so job-centered, this is the Michigan studies way of looking at it. The job-centered behavior paid close attention to the work of subordinates, explaining work procedures, demonstrating a strong interest in performance, as were the employee-centered behaviors attempted to build effective work groups and high-performance goals. Now, the Ohio State studies did something very similar, but they termed it a little bit different. It's what they would call leadership consideration behavior and initiating structure behavior. So initiating structure behavior had to do with clearly defining roles so that people knew what was expected of them. Consideration behaviors was showing concerns for subordinates' feeling and respecting subordinates' ideas. Okay, so the essential idea here, the common idea between all the behavioral approaches is that what leaders focused on task behaviors and on person behaviors, getting the task done, making sure that things were done well, making sure that performance was high. And the other behavior was focusing on people, helping people, showing concern for people, motivating people, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of the big idea about the behavior approaches. And there was one other interesting idea here. It was called the management grid. Now it's known as the leadership grid. In your book, it's figure 12.2. And you'll see that there's a grid here that shows concern for people, high or low, concern for production, high and low. And if you map somebody out on whether they're more concerned about the task or more concerned about people, it comes up with a different approach to leadership, all right? So for example, if you're high concern for people and low concern for production, that's what they would call country club management, right? Your organization is more like a social club. People are really highly concerned about one another, about getting along, about cohesion. Remember we talked about that last week in teams, cohesion, the needs of individual people, right? But they're not as concerned for production, for getting the task done, et cetera, et cetera. Now, on the other hand, if you look at an organization that has a high concern for production and a low concern for people, that's what's called authority compliance. Efficiency in operations results from arranging conditions of work in such a way that human elements interfere to a minimum degree. So this is really, kind of a high authoritarian. People don't really care. The leader does not really care about the people, only that the people get the job done. All right, so you can see that both of those extremes are probably not good. And so they coined what they called the high leader, who had a high concern for people and high concern for production. This is what they called team management, all right? So if you were high, that means you had a high concern for the production and high concern for the people as well. Now, later on, we're going to talk about the situational approaches, which challenge this high approach, because it would say that it's not always necessary to be high. Rather, depending on the situation, we should focus our energy either on the people side of leadership or the task side of leadership. So anyhow, those were what the behavioral approaches to leadership were all about. Now, after the behavioral approaches sort of ran their course, another approach to leadership emerged, which were called the situational leadership models. And these models assume that the appropriate leadership behavior varies from one situation to another, and it seeks to identify how key situational factors interact to determine appropriate leadership behavior. All right, so there's figure 12.3 shows something called the leadership continuum. All right, and this is a very interesting model that shows that that leaders can either give more freedom, right, or more authority, right? So a leader would exercise more authority versus giving more freedom depending upon various factors. Now, the next situational model that came along was called the LPC theory of leadership. This is Fiedler. This is called the least preferred coworker, or LPC. And this contends that a leader's effectiveness depends on the situation. And it basically said there was two types of leaders, and again, very similar to the behavioral approach, right? It's what they called the high LPC leader, and they're more concerned with interpersonal relationships, right? So these would be more of the people-oriented leaders, as opposed to the low LPC leaders, who are more concerned with task-relevant problems. And so it posits that situational favorableness factors determine proper leadership focus. And so basically, if you look at table 12.2, you'll see how this model unfolds. It's kind of complicated, to be honest, but I think in essence what this model would say is that depending on whether as a leader you either are LPC or high LPC or low LPC, that'll determine the kind of situation that you will flourish in the most. So this model sort of assumes that leaders' approach is fairly static, fairly fixed, right? That you can't really change back and forth from being people-oriented or task-oriented. Okay, so depending on which approach, generally speaking, you are more comfortable with, that you're more natural at, that you're stronger in, that will determine the kind of situation that you will flourish in as a leader. Now again, some of the later approaches, the more modern situational approaches that we'll look at later will challenge this, but that's what this approach said. It said that your situation was going to determine the effectiveness of your leadership, right? Okay, very good. Now, the next idea that came along was the path goal theory. Now, this is very similar to what we looked at in when we talked about motivation, the expectancy theory, right? The idea of expectancy that people would set goals, and depending on how important that goal was and whether how likely they were to achieve that goal, that's how motivated they would be. Well, path goal is very similar to that. It focuses on the situation and leader behavior and suggesting that leaders can readily adapt to different situations. All right, so this makes it a little different than the last approach, right? It assumes that leaders affect subordinates' performance by clarifying the behaviors or the paths that will lead to desired rewards. And so in this sense, leaders change up their approach to be more directive or supportive. Again, same idea, people, task. They change it up in order to help people meet their goals, right? So the leaders, it's all about, this approach says it's all about removing obstacles, of helping subordinates find adequate goals and helping them to reach their goals, all right? So there is a good illustration of this model, figure 12.4. It shows the different types of leader behavior, whether directive, supportive, participative, or achievement-oriented. And then there's also the situational factors there. Okay, so some of the characteristics of the subordinate, like locus of control, perceived ability, and environmental characteristics such as task structure, authority system, and work group. And all of these will lead to subordinates' motivation to perform. All right, a bit complicated. You're going to have to spend some time on these things. They don't really come easy. I remember when I first learned them, I had to go over them over and over again until finally at one point I said, oh, okay, I think I get how all these different variables work together. But try to get the main idea. To me, it's not as essential to learn, you know, all these specific details, but what's the big picture? What's the big picture of each of these items? Well, anyhow, that is it for our first set of leadership ideas. And we're going to go on in the next video and we're going to talk about some of the more contemporary approaches to leadership that are going to challenge some of these early ones, but also kind of give us some other ways of thinking about leadership that are very, very important. So anyhow, stay tuned, hang on, I'll see you in the next video.